You all. Thank you for having an opening in your schedule that just worked out so nicely. As I think we may have heard about it while we were still in Iona. I saw an email from Derek saying we need to cover one covenant class, and so I said, "Oh, well, I think I know how we could do that." And I'm just really so excited to have Ben Sparks here, who has such a history with this community and can tell us a little bit more about that. I wanted to start with an opening prayer, and some of you know I've been on a hiatus from buying books this year. That was my New Year's resolution. I've done okay, but I did make an exception and bought a couple of books from the bookstore. The Iona community has their own press, Wild Goose Publications. And one of the things they're known for, and Ben will talk a little bit about this, is the worship, and particularly the language in worship. It's just really remarkable. And so this is their current worship book. It's in all the pews in the Abbey. And then, of course, it's for sale. So I'm going to read a prayer from this book to get us started. Let us pray. Eternal God, maker of the skies above, lowly Christ, lover of the earth and its people, unfettered Spirit, giver of gracious gifts, you are present among us. O hidden mystery, Son behind all sons, soul within all souls, in all we touch, in all we meet, you are present among us. As bearers of your image, we come to be reshaped. Dependent on your mercy, we ask to be made new. Amen. Some of you probably are aware that for a few years now, I think it dates back to J-term of 2020, Janet LeGros, who had been a covenant pastor for a few months at that time, taught a J-term course on centering prayer, which is a kind of contemplative prayer. And because that's been a part of my personal devotional practice, I joined in for that class and I think filled in for one Sunday that she couldn't be there. And many of the people who came to that were new to centering prayer, but were interested enough that when Janet and I offered to continue offering a weekly group, we had a good number of people who wanted to do that. So that group has been meeting weekly ever since. And Janet has been kind of the primary facilitator, but she and I have shared leadership. We've read a number of books on contemplative Christianity, some specifically about centering prayer, some more about contemplative practices in general, and some much, much older books that form some of the foundation and understanding of the current version of centering prayer. Janet, in her ministry, and Janet has a history of doing a lot of ministry with young people, has been a big proponent of the pilgrimage and the value of going away somewhere and getting out of your sort of normal comfort zone and routines and learning something new. So the last year for centering prayer, that was kind of our topic for the year, was pilgrimage. And some of the books we read were related to that, including a memoir of someone who walked the Camino in Spain, some other things, and started talking about what it would look like for us to take a pilgrimage. Then Janet learned that her husband, Jeff, who's a professor at the University of Richmond, was going to be on sabbatical in London for the year at the London School of Economics. So we thought if we did want to take a pilgrimage, we could meet up with her and go to Iona, where none of our group had ever been before. So it was new for all of us. So I'm really delighted that Kathy and Chip Hoke are here today to talk about their experience. When we planned this, we thought they were going to be the only ones from our group who were here today. Charlotte Woodfin was also on the trip, and then a friend of the church who's not a member who also joined us. But we do have 4 other people who went and then stayed on and traveled some more and just got home last night, but I guess they felt like they could come today. So John and Linda Starr, aka my wonderful parents, and Lee and Sally Brown. So we're really glad to have them too, so you can ask them after about their experience. And y'all feel free to chime in. So we're going to start with me and Kathy and Chip. In my Bible study the week after I got back, Foster Jennings said in his family, their tradition is when you go away somewhere, when you come back, you have to share your 3 favorite memories of the trip. So we're going to each share ours, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what the book that we read while we were there, and how that added to our time. So while we do that, I'll scroll through some pictures so you can see the beautiful landscape of Iona, which, just to situate you, if you aren't aware, the island of Iona, it's a tiny little island in what's called the Hebrides, this string of islands off the west coast of Scotland. If you're in Edinburgh, which is further east, you have to take a train to Glasgow, get on a different train to Oban, take a ferry from Oban to Cranmere, take a bus from Cranmere across the island of Mull to the western side, and then take another ferry to get to Iona. Iona itself is tiny. It's about 3 miles wide and 3 long, 1 wide, something like that. So there are points on the island where you can stand there and almost get a 360-degree view of the water. Not quite, but definitely on either side. So lots of rainbows. It's Scotland. The clouds are always moving. The rain's always coming and going, although we did have some really beautiful weather. So this is just some pictures of as we were starting out. Most of us flew into Edinburgh and then met up there and started on the journey to Iona. And this is pretty much what it looked like when we arrived. I will say that one of my favorite memories of this was that it just really brought me back to a very formative time in my life. After my first year in seminary, I did a year-long internship at a Presbyterian church in Belfast, Northern Ireland. So I spent a year in the UK. I was able to do a lot of traveling while I was there. And it's amazing, those sensory memories. I walked out of the airport in Edinburgh, and just the smells and the feel of the air, it just took me right back. And of course, all the tea and the scones and the food memories and everything else, it just really was special to me. I hadn't been back in over 20 years, so that was really neat. This on the right-hand picture is part of the Abbey, which is, there is an abbey that has people who live there year-round, I think, still. Yeah. And we'll hear a little bit more about that from Ben, who's had that experience, but they worship there several times a day. So we were able to go to worship in the Abbey. And our hotel room, you can see one of the little rooms was called the Hotel St. Columba. Columba was the saint from Ireland who discovered the island of Iona and founded the monastic community there. So most of our rooms were very simple but lovely, and right next to the Abbey, the hotel was. The second thing I would say is my favorite memory was worshiping in the Abbey. It was just a really moving experience. They were incredibly welcoming and inclusive. They have visitors from all over the world at every service. And I really loved especially the language that they use and their liturgy and the hymns. And there was a service that we went to, an evening service that was a service of peace and at that time they focused on peace in Israel and Palestine, and that was very moving as well. And that's the Abbey there on the left-hand side. Saw lots of sheep. And then the third thing I would say is just being, the whole pilgrimage experience of taking this group that had been together for a long time, learning together, praying together, and being in a different space and spending really quality time together and getting to share with and learn from each other. So with that, I'm going to invite.
So hi, I'm Chip. My 3 memories I'm going to share are all sort of outdoor memories, maybe, since I think we'd all say ditto to what Amy said about the worship. My first memory, and if you've looked at these pictures, you see that these are, they were almost an hourly occurrence, I would say, are rainbows. But we didn't know that at the time when we got there. And as she was describing, it was, a journey when you're wiped out after jet lag and then getting on a couple of trains. And Kathy and I flew in and took the trains through Glasgow and to Oban. and spent the night there before continuing on with the bus ride and everything. And there was a lot of worry in that. And my first memory of the rainbow was that morning when we woke up in Oban and went to breakfast, and we were really worried about the ferries and the bus and meeting up with the rest of the group. And sheets of rain are blowing against the window as we eat breakfast. And then within about 15 minutes, the rain was gone, the sun was out, and a beautiful rainbow was across the bay looking out of the window in Oban. And just sort of know everything's going to be all right. In fact, we had beautiful weather for the whole time we were there. So that was fantastic. The other memory, and this one really is an outdoor, is all the walks that Kathy and I took together around hiking around Iona. And there are lots of choices of maps you can get, and they all have these tracks on them that are supposed to be there. But be warned, if you ever go, you will never see one of these tracks that are on the map. And, so what you end up doing is you just sort of go around and approximate where it looks like you ought to be. And then you start heading across the fields where the cows and the sheep are, and, through fences and things. And fortunately in the UK, we learned later that there's something called freedom to roam, which allows you to access these places by going across people's fields and so on. But we had some lovely walks doing that, and that's kind of an interesting memory to get up the nerve to just sort of, okay, we'll go through this gate and through this field and out and further on. And finally, one of the first walks we took, and it took us 2 tries to get there because we didn't realize how far it was to Columba Bay, where St. Columba supposedly first landed with his small group. And on that walk, you walk, I guess, essentially 3 holes of a golf course to find the trailhead behind hole number 3. And after waiting for people to tee off and finish putting out, we made our way and actually found what we thought was the trailhead and kept going. And finally, it was confirmed by a lovely gentleman who was coming down the hill and stop to talk to us and give us directions and tell us we were actually on the right path and tell us what to do, which is something we had happen over and over while we were there, just meeting lovely people who were very helpful. So that's my 3 memories, and I'll take those with me. So, yeah.
So I'll pick up on Chip's. Think of all the people we met who were so nice on this island. But the first getting on the island and realizing just how small it was, and also as the ferry is leaving, there's no getting off it. And so there's a lot of little angst there. But being on the island and being fascinated, these people live here, and seeing the children, we would be walking, and then families were becoming, because they, I guess, had taken the ferry. There was not a school on the island. And so seeing all this evidence of self-sufficiency that they had to have to live on the island. So and the people were so nice all the time. So the people was my first memory. Second memory, picking up on Amy, the services at the Abbey, which we went each morning, some evenings, but the very first one, so we got there on Saturday night, the very first one we went to was their bigger service on Sunday morning, which was later in the day, and we had a group meeting first, so we're running a little late, and we're running to, Chip and I are running to get to the Abbey on time, and I'm one of these, you gotta be on time people, and I'm so anxious. I'm thinking, they have visitors all the time. They probably hate it when people interfere and come in late. And so we walk in, and this group of women meet you at the door, have the most warmest welcome I've ever felt. We are so glad you're here. Not mentioning we were late, and helped us find a seat. Let me help you find a seat. Here's what you need to get going. So that was like my welcoming into, and then the rest of the services at the Abbey were really incredible. As I think there was a picture up there of one of them with where we lit the candles for peace and made a dove. Yeah. And then finally, picking up on, it's always good to go last. You're saying the same thing everybody else did, but the group meetings. So we had this group that I had only met via Zoom for most of us, because that's how we do our centering prayer. And so we had 7 group meetings over the course of the 3 days. It's one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And so we were reading this book, and then we would practice centering prayer. And so this book, Sacred Spaces by Margaret Self, effectively guides you to reflect on different aspects of life by using the 7 stations along the Celtic Way as metaphors. So each individual or couple on in the trip took a chapter to lead. And then we also agreed that we would each share 3 of our sacred spaces on our turn. And I have to say, the sharing that the people did there and were at least as or probably more powerful than the examples in the book, and really broadened my understanding of the word sacred. And so with that, we thought we would talk about the book some more.
So one of the books we read during our pilgrimage year before we went was a John Philip Newell book on Celtic Christianity. John Philip Newell has a long association with the Iona community as well. I think he was the leader there for a couple of years. Warden of the Abbey. Mm-hmm. So, there's so much Celtic influence both in Iona and in Scotland. And part of that was St. Columba coming over from Ireland and bringing some of that influence with him. But kind of in a word, I would say, or not a word, a sentence, what sets Celtic Christianity apart in many ways is the deep belief that God can be found in everything, and particularly in nature, in air and sea and sky, and that is that we can know God and worship God in the natural world. So in this book, Margaret Self takes us through what she calls stations on a Celtic way and examines 7 Celtic either sort of symbols or places that have a particular meaning in one's journey of faith, and really helped us to think about what we might learn from these. So Kathy and Chip and I are just gonna, we each were allowed 1 sentence to talk about each of them. I told them my sentences are run on because it was really hard to get it into 1 sentence, but I would highly recommend the book. I have a copy that somebody can borrow if you want. It was just so meaningful, I think, for all of us to reflect on what have been some of these sacred spaces in our own lives and in our own faith journeys. And people shared some of those when we in our discussions, things like, a half-mile walk through the woods to catch the school bus and then to come home as a child. Or somebody talked about their dining room table where their family has gathered for so many years for everyday meals and special occasions. The beach for some people, or a particular beach, had been particularly meaningful, or the woods or trees for others. So things like that were really meaningful to reflect on. So the first of these 7 stations that Sylph talks about is the infinite knot. I had always thought of this as like the Celtic knot, but the Celtics call it an infinite knot. If you gaze at it for a few moments, you'll realize it's really hard to tell where it begins and where it ends. And that's the idea. So Sylph says that to ponder the infinite knot puts us in a suspended state of contradiction, since we can really only see a small part of the whole at once. It's hard to take in the whole thing. And that helps us realize how we are all connected and that there's something bigger than just our limited individual view. She says that if you think of where you might be on that knot, sometimes it's hard to tell if you're in one of the under spaces or if you're in one of the over spaces, and it takes time for you to discover that. The second is the High Cross. The one on the right is actually at the Iona Abbey. I think that's a picture that I took, and it's too small to see, but in the very center at the top where they intersect is carved a very sort of crude mother and child. And the plaque below it talked about how the sort of revering of Mother Mary began on Iona in many, that there's some belief that that tradition has come out of that. So a high cross turns our gaze to something beyond ourselves. It points to heaven. These high crosses would have had pictures on them, which provided an illiterate people the stories of their faith, these biblical stories. They reminded travelers that their journeys, when they came upon the cross, were part of the whole human journey. And because, and the crosses belonged to everyone. They were almost like a national park. You know, they were public property. And then the Celtic cross, which has the circle around that intersection, speaks to the, there's the intersection of the horizontal and the vertical, the human and the divine, and the circle around it represents the wholeness of that. So.
And then the next one was hilltops, which were a metaphor for identifying the right direction to take and finding the energy to do that in life. I really like, I'm going to read a quote from the book. It says that hilltops afford a view, a fresh perspective of the land from which we have come, and new insights into the journey that still lies ahead. But then it goes on to talk about we find the energy to get to one place, but then there's always another higher one. So whenever a summit is reached, there always seems to be another higher one just out of reach, demanding another burst of energy to reach it. And another thing I really liked about this book, in addition to talking about the different stations, she also did a sort of a fresh interpretation on sometimes familiar, sometimes unfamiliar Bible passages to illustrate the same point. And one of the ones she used for hilltops was Moses and the burning bush.
So the next station on the journey was Wells. And, a theme running through this whole thing in every chapter was reflection on one's own life. And in this particular chapter, that's really the point. Wells, in her sort of metaphor of life, represent turning places in life where we may be forced to face and reflect on dark spaces, like the dark shaft of a well, that we have to go through in order to reach the life-giving water at the bottom and then turn back towards the light. So one of the things that Sylph does in the book is rewrite Bible passages to illustrate her topics. And in this one, she very effectively uses John chapter 4, where Jesus encounters the woman at the well and has her face her true life. And then next is groves and springs, whereas wells, you might have to go through a dark place to find the energy to go on. Groves and springs are places in life where the living energy just sort of wells forth. And she talks about how that can most frequently come from close friendships and a circle of friends, but also she reflects on sort of the Celtic point of view of universal hospitality and welcoming of strangers. I thought, just to sort of say one of the things that almost like what Amy was talking about, I thought I'd read one quote in here that sort of goes with the Celtic vision. It says, "In the Celtic vision, we are strangers passing through God's creation, yet each with the power to affect that creation, either for better or for worse. Every individual makes a difference. It's our own choice as to what that difference shall be, either creative or destructive." So I thought that sort of summed up a lot of the theology that we heard preached while we were there.
In case you've lost track, we're on the sixth one, which is crossing places. So this was about transitions in life. And it talked about that sometimes these crossings sometimes require facing fears, possibly giving up dreams, maybe some risk. but then finding the way to move forward. And the biblical passage, one of the ones she used here was when Jesus walks on water and Peter tries to take the step toward him.
And the pictures there, because she talked about bridges and causeways and cemeteries when she talked about crossing places, these places that help us get from one place to another. And then the seventh is what she called boundaries. And I think everyone in the group agreed that when we went to read that chapter, we had one thing in our mind, and it was a little different than what she talked about. They're not boundaries like we think of as obstacles or sort of dividers or sort of opaque dividers, but rather liminal spaces. So she uses the example of moments or places when we're between two worlds and that feel holy in a way that we might not be able to articulate. So sunrise and sunset, and how many people feel drawn to those particular times of day. And those are these liminal spaces. Windows that offer us a boundary between inside and outside, but let us see through. And doorways as well, when we're passing over thresholds from one space to another. All of this can kind of be a metaphor, and she talks about it for birth as well as for death, for the wilderness and the promised land. And in this one, the biblical story she talked about was Moses, and particularly Moses getting to see the promised land, but not crossing over into it. She calls all of these gateways to eternity and the divine. I think that was what our group wanted to share. Again, I'm sure any of us would love to talk more about it, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end, but I want to be sure that we have time to hear from Ben. So going from this idea of boundaries, these gateways to eternity and the divine, and this idea of liminal space, it's a great segue to the Iona Island and the Iona community. Iona has long been found by many people to be a kind of a liminal space where you almost feel, people have said they feel closer to the divine. For me, there was just this experience of being on such a small island. But one of my kids pointed out, really, Mom, isn't every land an island on the earth? I was like, well, yes, I guess, technically. But being on such a small island and just having this sense of that island being held by these waters, almost like the arms of God holding us. So I'm excited that we have somebody here to talk about the Iona community, which is really what the Abbey represents. And its history, because he has lived it for, I'm going to say 60 years. But first, before Ben comes up here, I'll just share, if you don't know this about Ben, he was the 11th pastor of Richmond's Second Presbyterian Church and served in that role for 25 years, from 1982 to 2007. Before that, after he spent time in Iona, he pastored in Roanoke, Jacksonville, Florida, and Nashville, Tennessee. He's always had a deep heart for urban ministry and urban churches, meaningful worship and effective preaching. He served on the Union Presbyterian Seminary Board and taught classes there on urban ministry. He's also had a real heart for people living without homes. He served on numerous local boards and helped to start Caritas and Homeward and Richmond Hill, which is Richmond's kind of own community, Christian ecumenical community. All of that, it seems to me, would have flowed quite nicely from his time with the Iona community. I'm sure it must have been incredibly influential for someone right out of seminary to spend time there. So I'm so glad he can talk to us about that today and explain the history and the vision of that community. So Ben, welcome.
Thanks very much, Amy. That was a great introduction. It did make me understand better even how influential that community was on my life. It created a new reality in me coming from the from the Southern Presbyterian Church to Scotland was an enormous boundary, crossing of a boundary, and especially in the Ireland community, where I met the founder, and who, fortunately, I joined the community when he was still active. For the first time in my life, I met a socialist and a pacifist, which for a Southern boy was a big deal. I mean, I'd really crossed a boundary there. George MacLeod, I want to say, well, first of all, I want to say a word about the island, because the island, Columba came with a company of men. I don't know, they say 12, but that could be apocryphal. He came from Ireland. He had been a warrior, a very successful warrior, and at some point he was converted away from war to the gospel, and he brought this, and he left Ireland and brought this little company to this island in Scotland that became Iona in 563 AD. That's a long time ago. And one of the most important things about going and spending time in a place like that is realizing that we think, 1619 is old? Not very. I mean, you think about the oldest churches in America, and they are infants compared to this, where the gospel has been alive since 563. That was the Celtic church. It had, Amy described some of the emphases and realities of the Celtic worship. If you've ever seen any Celtic prayers, some of them are so ordinary. Oh, God, be with me in the building of the peat fire and the kneading of bread, and they're all very earthy and simple and common things. The other thing to say about the island, because of this abbey, the abbey you see, and even that ruin that was the last thing the last picture you had up there was that of the ruin of one of the chapels. The Benedictine order came to Scotland. By then, the church in Scotland had been more or less Romanized, and the Celtic church had diminished. So Queen Margaret brought her favorite religious order to Scotland, the Benedictines, and they actually built what you see in about the 12th century, 11th century. I'm fuzzy on that. There were 7 chapels originally around that abbey. And what the community did was go there with craftsmen and ministers, because George MacLeod, the founder, that guy, was insistent that the church get to know the working class. It was very much a middle and upper middle class operation in Scotland. George was one of its most illustrious products. Quote, he was the most important preacher in the UK. At 29 years old, he had the most prestigious pulpit in Edinburgh, and he was broadcast all over the nation in the evening. And so ministers would have to move the time of their evening service if they wanted a congregation, because people would sit home and listen to George rather than come to church. So that was a huge impact he made on Scotland and the UK even before all this. So he gave up that prestigious pulpit and moved to Glasgow and to Govan parish, which was a large working class parish. He wanted to get back to the men that he had met in the First World War. This is a privileged guy. He grew up wealthy. He went to Gordonston, where I think King Charles went. And he was privileged. But in the war, during the First World War, he met all these working class guys whom he admired greatly. So he went to Govan and gave up this pulpit, which itself was controversial. At Govan, he preached the things you heard about already, about the common life, about the meaning of the gospel. At Govan, he argued with communists publicly. He continued that for several years, and then and during the Depression, he began all these industries in Govan and in Glasgow. And out of that grew this vision to return to Iona, and to rebuild. The abbey had been there. The abbey was restored by the Duke of Argyll in around 1900, 1902. But the rest of the abbey was in ruins. You know, the refectory, the everything, the living quarters, all of that. And that's what George and these workmen and ministers did. And in the early days, they lived in tents on the island. But they organized this whole thing around worship and work. So they had morning and evening services. They had communion on Sunday. They had all of what you experience now, but it was, let me say, a lot more primitive. And when I was there, actually, it was so primitive on Iona. There were two vehicles on the whole island. The Columba Hotel had one vehicle, and the Abbey had the other one. Oh, sorry, there were three. The postman had a little mini vehicle he rode around in. And there were no fences. That was another thing. When I go back, I haven't been back since 2017, but when I go back now, these fences everywhere, it's incredible. And you have to figure out, you're right, Chip, you have to figure out how to get where you're going because they're in place now and you have to walk around them. And before, you just walked freely. Because in Scotland, there was no such thing as no trespassing. The land was, this is true historically, it was completely open, but you couldn't tamper with a sheep. And you couldn't, you had to leave the animals alone if you were walking. And the reason there are now fences on Iona, I'm sorry to say, is because it has become so popular and so many tourists that they started feeding the sheep things that they shouldn't be feeding them. And it really created a scene with the farmers. So that's when the thing got fenced. All right, enough. Let me move on to George MacLeod. He really was a remarkable guy. He was a mystic. He was an extraordinary preacher and a very gifted worship leader, which is where this language that you admire so much on Iona really had its foundation. It's not the same language. Let me be clear. It was very traditional when George was doing this. But part of what I want to say for me was transformative was the fact that I had never worshiped like this. It was not Episcopal worship, but it was close. Every Sunday we had communion. It was just a typical preaching of the word and celebration of the sacrament, except that George at that time was a Queen's chaplain, so he wore a red cassock. And so he would come out of one of the transepts with the bread, a huge platter of bread, plus the bread that would be served. And then I think the crystal goblets that contained the wine were already on the communion table, which is this. You had one picture of that, didn't you? I think you did. Yeah, it's a huge block of green and white marble. It's an amazing piece of work that sits underneath a clear window so that when you sit in there and the sun is beaming through this window. It's just breathtaking, really, isn't it? So anyway, he would bring, and we would go in like that with behind him, those of us who were serving, stand behind the table. And when we walked in, what we sang was, let me read it to you because I'll forget it. We were singing a hymn. Every Sunday it was the same hymn. Ye gates, lift up your heads on high. Ye doors that last for aye, be lifted up, that so the King of glory enter may. But who of glory is the King? The mighty Lord is this. E'en that same Lord that great in might and strong in battle is. Anybody knows where that comes from? What psalm that is? It's the latter part of Psalm 24. Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. And so we sang that every week. It changes your life. I don't want to be too, but it did. It changed my life. It made me long for that sort of worship everywhere I've ever been. The other worship service I want to talk about is the Friday night communion. We had youth in the summer. There are youth camps all summer long, And so they had a Friday night communion for the youth. And the three hymns there were, one of them was, "We Shall Overcome." Now, this is in 1965. I'm a Southerner. That just alone was really impressive. But what really got me was that when he did the same thing for communion that he did on Sunday morning, George did. So he's walking in with the elements and we're singing, "He's got the whole world in his hands." This is George MacLeod's genius for connecting realities, the reality of our worship to the reality of a larger world. I mean, it's just wonderful stuff. So let me move on a minute. I went to Scotland. It is almost 60 years. It's getting close. I went to Scotland in 1965. I graduated from Union, went home to Atlanta to get ordained, got on a plane, and was in Scotland in time for Pentecost Sunday, which was a huge outdoor communion service, for which they had organized the ferries, because when I went to Scotland, there were no ferries on Sunday. I mean, we're talking about a Calvinistic culture. Excuse me. So there were no ferries, but they had organized the ferries and brought all these people on Sunday to the island. There were 500 people at the service outdoors with a long table covered in white with all the elements and everything on it. George invites everybody there to take communion. And the press was there. Representatives of the royal family were there. I mean, it's a big deal. I don't know. It's a big deal in the whole of Britain, not just Scotland. So the next week, the papers all over Britain were just full of the heretical event that happened on Iona. I mean, he opened the table. You don't know who might have been there. There were atheists there. And he just welcomed everybody. And furthermore, those people, they ran the ferries on Sunday. That was, I'm not exaggerating. It was really controversial. But that was George. He was always controversial. In the beginning, people really resented the way he changed worship in Scotland. Because in Scotland, you just sat there and it was very passive. You could sing. You could say the creed maybe if they said it. But you don't do responses. That's Catholic, so we can't have it. And really, in Scotland, the religious issues were Catholic Protestant. There is an Episcopal Church. It is pitifully weak now, unfortunately. But it was not that weak when I was there. But the bipolarity is Catholic Protestant, not the Episcopalians don't figure in it at all. We had daily worship, 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. The evening services was one for divine healing, one for commitment called an act of belief, and on Sunday night, because George's mother was a Quaker, we had 10 or 15 minutes of silence. That was really a powerful service, actually. Something I'd never experienced. In fact, most of this I'd never experienced. So I lived on the island for a summer, and then I was apprenticed to a member of the island community for 2 full years. So I stayed in Scotland nearly 3 years. And that also was a huge change, but I don't want to dwell on that, except that we were working in the parish to promote and help people understand the emphases of the island community. So there is a daily rule, which is daily prayer and scripture reading, engaging in social and political action, and belonging, if you're in Scotland, you belong to a small group that meets monthly, some of which have communion, some don't, but it's a sharing, it's a group of sharing, much like what you all just described about your time on Iona in the small group. It's exactly the same idea. But you keep connected in community. I've missed one thing, I'm going to go back. So I think I said that what the Iona community did was restore all the buildings of the Abbey that were not the church. So that includes the entry to complex. When you go into that complex, you're entering through the West Range, and you walk straight ahead and you come to the cloisters. And how George got this, I'll never know, but in this cloister is a sculpture, and it's called The Descent of the Dove. And it's a picture, it's a big, this is a huge thing. It's probably not 6 feet, but it's probably 5 feet tall. This dove is coming down on what is really meant to be the world, that comes around like this and goes into Mary's womb. And it is resting on 3 or 4 lambs, this whole thing. And on the reverse side of the sculpture, it says, I, Jacob Lipchitz, faithful to the faith of my fathers, create this sculpture of the, I don't know whether it's called the descent of the Spirit. Well, I'm losing the exact quote, but I create this sculpture so that the whole world may live in peace. And he was a persecuted Jew who left Poland and then went to France, and then when the Nazis came, he had to leave that, finally made it to the United States. Somehow George got it. The other thing about this is in the cloisters, there are small columns holding up the roof, and all these columns have wildflowers around the top, the capital. All the capitals of these small columns, they represent the wildflowers of all the countries where George went to raise money for the community. And really, I mean, it's Canada, it's Australia, it's New Zealand, it's America, it's Britain, of course, England and Scotland. So, what else did I want to tell you? I think that's enough. Let me stop and see if there are any questions. We got about 10 minutes, and I want to close with a prayer, but let's have questions first. Anything? Comments? Disagreements? I love dialogue. Go for it. Yes.
Did you know who George was baptized in his stature?
Yes, all that was there. What I'm talking about was what I saw when I first went. That's 1965. But the parts of the Abbey were not finished. For example, the capitals of the columns were just bare, plain. They were there. The cloisters had been built. We finished up the West Range, our group. There were 12 of us there, 3 Americans. I was the only American that stayed for 2 years. The others were doing like an intern year and came home. One from Yale and one from maybe Union in New York or Princeton. Yale and Union in New York had serious connections to the Iona community. And George had been over here many times speaking at Union, and he was a great pal of John Oliver Nelson, whose name is known to, who was a big deal at Yale for years. I don't know whether he was head of the divinity school, but the name it's a big thing in American ecclesiastical history. Anyway, right. So it was what I described to you was there, with no cars and no fences.
Had you heard of George McLeod before?
Well, I had, because the person who suggested that I go to Iona was my professor, Ross McKenzie, not to be confused with the editor. This is a different Ross McKenzie. He was teaching at Union then. I took a class of his, 1 hour, it's kind of a crip course, on the new communities in Europe that had grown up after the Second World War. Excuse me. This is a big deal in Europe. The First and Second World Wars devastated the faith of Europe. Devastated it. And people were really searching. And these communities grew up. In Germany, there were lay academies. In France, there's the Taizé community, which probably many of you have heard of. And George, I didn't say this earlier, George founded this community in 1938. But of course, it was interrupted during the war. It really took off in 1945, 46, and scores of ministers from the Church of Scotland, and a couple from England joined this community. So it flourished in the 50s and became established. But yes, I had heard of it. And then when I was moaning about I didn't feel called to anything I was talking to, or that people were looking at me, my senior year in seminary, Ross McKenzie said, well, Ben, why don't you go and join the honor community? And I thought, well, Ross, how do you do that? What do I do to get in? He said, I'll write you a letter. And about 2 weeks later, a letter came from them and inviting me to join. So off I went right away.
I think it's a little harder now.
Well, not only that, but it's all changed. I mean, when I went over there, you still had to spend a summer on the island and 2 years in the parish. And that was also an innovation George made. He believed, and he was right, that many people graduated from divinity school in Scotland. There were four, St. Andrews, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen. So there were 4 divinity schools. You graduated and you went and served under a minister for 6 months. You didn't know anything. You didn't know your community. You might have known how to be a minister, but you didn't know anything. And of course, there are no practical courses at seminaries in those days. There is no pastoral counseling. I don't know how much worship there was. They didn't need worship. I guess that I don't even know that they taught preaching. I'm not sure how. I think you learned that as an apprentice. George said, this is useless. People need to be in place for 2 years. And he got it done. Again, it was a fight in Scotland, but he finally got it established so that somebody who went to a church, after 2 years, you really knew the community in which you served. And he did that in part because he believed the community is the focus of the church, not inside. It's not how we are feeling about everything. It's how we are being equipped to be ministers in the community. Sorry. It is similar. It's similar. The big difference is that the membership in Richmond Hill is pretty much the residential community and the leader. And I'll tell you, I argued with Ben Campbell for a long time about this, that we ought to have membership, that everybody buys into a certain rule and lives in the community, because otherwise it has to, and they do raise a lot of money, and they've been successful, and it's been and I'm grateful that Richmond has something like this, which lives 24 hours a day praying for the city and all the parts of the city that matter. And Ben Campbell did a great job in founding that. But that's kind of, it's a different feeling. I mean, if you belong to the honor community, you take on some obligations personally. So, anything else? I'm not sure how they work that. I've really lost touch with the new member.
I think that is true. I went to just an information session, and they were saying because you can be a full member, and you do have to spend residential time at the community, or you can be an associate member. It doesn't have quite the same requirements.
Well, and the difference would be that there are new classes. I mean, I see them in the book. There are new classes every year. And the other thing I should say, in the early days, lay people didn't have to join. They joined, but they only had to come for 1 month. They did other activities in their communities. I mean, for example, one guy that was legendary in the community I've lost his name, but he had a stammer. And at every community meeting, he would start off these speeches, and then he would get up and he would just rail against nuclear weapons. He actually worked in the shipyard where the nuclear weapons were housed in Scotland. And he was Roger Gray, and everybody knew him and loved him, but also got tired of him. And you know how that is. But he was, I mean, that was an example of the kind of lay people. There were others that made enormous contributions in their communities. The laity I'm talking about, not the ministers. It's almost done. Let me close with prayer. This is a prayer of George McLeod's from the Iona community. Excuse me. O Christ, the master carpenter, who at the last through wood and nails purchased our whole salvation, wield well your tools in the workshop of your world, so that we who come rough-hewn to your bench will be fashioned to a truer beauty by your hand. Amen.
Thank you all.